All right, starting with muscle atrophy. It is sad, but the truth is, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. At least when it comes to muscle mass. You can train at the gym and gain nice muscle tone. But if you stop training, your muscle mass would atrophy, which is the opposite of hypertrophy. Atrophy is loss of myofibrils and myofilaments in as little as 2 weeks. If you really choose to live a sedentary life, the actual number of muscle fibers may decline, and you already learned few minutes ago and that how difficult it is to gain those fibers back through myoblast. All right, moving on to reflexes. What are reflexes? Reflexes are involuntary, automatic, and rapid reactions of muscles or glands to a stimulus. They are involuntary, therefore, can you control it? No, it's automatic. When I was little, as I mentioned before in class, every single time I used to go to the doctor for my, wellness check, and I would plan in my mind, this time when the doctor or the nurse taps my knee, I'm not going to jerk it. I'll be brave and I will prove them wrong. As a 6-year-old, I did not know that it's an involuntary response. All right. So that's reflex. It's rapid, automatic, and involuntary reaction of muscles or glands to a stimulus. Now, obviously, for a reflex to happen, you do need a stimulus, right? And the response is actually super quick with minimal delay. Therefore, it involves only few neurons because the processing time has to be left. We don't have the luxury of time to send all the sensory information to higher order thinking parts of the brain. And then the brain takes its own time to decide and send a motor command back. No, we cannot do that. So it has to be a super quick response that involves very few neurons. And for reflexes, the automatic response occurs in the same way every time. So if you tap your knee 5 times, the response will be the same all 5 times. Now, 2 types of reflex arcs we will talk about. The first one is ipsilateral, where the receptor and the effector are on the same side of the body. And the most common example is when we touch a hot object. What happens? When we touch a hot object, obviously there are receptors on the fingers and hand that sense it, and the information then goes to the spinal cord. The spinal cord decides what action to take, sends out a motor command, and the command comes to our skeletal muscles of the hands, which contract, and we immediately withdraw our hand. My point is, in this case, the receptors which are present on the skin and the effectors, which are the skeletal muscles, they are on the same side of the body. So that's what makes it an ipsilateral reflex. Contralateral reflexes have sensors and receptors on the opposite side of the body. For example, when we step on a nail, if we are a normal person, we feel the pain, right? And as you feel the pain, obviously you withdraw your foot. However, in order to withdraw the foot, do you have to use your other leg to balance yourself? Yes, you do. Therefore, I want you to understand, as you step on the nail with one foot, you feel the pain. However, the muscles on your other leg are working to maintain balance so you don't fall down. So we have the receptors and the effectors on the opposite side of the body, And this is a classic example of contralateral reflex. Two other types of reflexes, monosynaptic and polysynaptic. Monosynaptic reflex is the most common type of reflex, where you have a sensory neuron coordinating with a motor neuron. There is no interneuron involved. And knee jerk is a classic example. So here we see a knee tap. The blue neuron is a sensory neuron that carries the information to the spinal cord. And the sensory neuron talks to a motor neuron that brings out a motor command to your quadriceps muscle, which then contracts. There is absolutely no interneuron involved. Simplest type of reflex, we call it monosynaptic. Looking at a polysynaptic reflex on the right hand side, polysynaptic reflex is where you have a sensory neuron carrying the sensory information to your central nervous system, and then there is an interneuron. Do you see the purple neuron here? The interneuron receives the sensory information and it integrates or processes that information before it sends out a motor command to the motor neuron. So we have incoming information, then we have processing here by the interneuron, and then this is the outgoing motor command that goes to the effector, in this case skeletal muscles. So we understand monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes. Talking about the different types of reflex arcs, we will talk about the stretch reflex, and then we will also talk about reciprocal innervation or withdrawal reflex, and we will also talk about crossed extensor reflex. As we talked about in the previous slide, monosynaptic reflex is the simplest type of reflex. As you see, you have a knee tap. The sensory neurons, don't worry about the term alpha, beta, or extrafusal muscle fiber, intrafusal muscle fiber. Don't worry about those terms a lot. So looking at a monosynaptic reflex. Now, first thing, know that a stretch reflex is a monosynaptic reflex that monitors and regulates skeletal muscle length. Stretch in a muscle is monitored by stretch receptors called muscle spindles. In this diagram, do you see muscle spindle? Yes, that's a muscle spindle that monitors stretch in a muscle. Okay, so it actually monitors passive tension, that is the tension developed from the muscle being stretched. When a stimulus results in the stretching of a muscle, the muscle reflexively contracts. The patellar or knee jerk reflex is a monosynaptic reflex. This is an example of stretch reflex. The stimulus or the tap on the patella tendon initiates contractions of the quadriceps femoris muscles and leads to extension of the knee joint. You should have actually learned this information in anatomy. So here, so this is knee tap, which stimulates the spindle here, and then the sensory neuron carry that information to the central nervous system, which is a spinal cord. The sensory neuron then talks to a motor neuron, and a motor neuron sends a motor command to the muscle. So here we do not see an interneuron, making it a monosynaptic reflex. Now let's read through the blue boxes. So we are striking the patellar ligament, and as we strike the patellar ligament, that stretches the tendon and the quadriceps femoris. As it gets stretched, that activates sensory neurons, And the sensory neurons then carry the information to the central nervous system. In this case, we are looking at a spinal cord. And the sensory neuron then coordinates with the motor neuron. And the motor neuron then stimulates the muscle fiber to contract. All right. Now, I want to know that reflexes can be an important diagnostic tool. Clinicians use them to test specific muscle groups and specific spinal nerves or segments of spinal cord. Although some variations in reflexes is normal, a consistently abnormal response might indicate damage to the nervous system or muscles. A reflex response may be normal, hypoactive, or hyperactive. The term hypoactive reflex means that a reflex response is diminished or absent. A hypoactive reflex may indicate damage to the segment of a spinal cord, or it may suggest muscle disease or even damage to the neuromuscular junction. A hyperactive reflex refers to abnormally strong response. It may indicate damage somewhere either in the brain or in the spinal cord. All right. Moving on to withdrawal reflex. Now, withdrawal or flexor reflex is a polysynaptic reflex arc, meaning it has interneurons involved. And you can see the interneurons by the interneurons are the green neurons located or fully contained within the spinal cord. Okay. And these reflexes are initiated by a painful stimulus such as touching something very hot or someone forcefully grabbing your hand. In the picture here, you do see the withdrawal reflex on the left-hand side. Now, stimulation of a receptor organ causes transmission of sensory information to the spinal cord, as shown by the blue arrows here. Interneurons receive the sensory information and stimulate motor neurons to direct flexor muscles to contract in response. So here, the sensory information goes to the spinal cord. It goes to the interneurons, which integrate that information and decides what action to take. Then the interneuron sends out a motor command to the flexor muscles to contract. Now, something else is happening here as well. Simultaneously, the antagonistic muscles are inhibited so that the traumatized body part may be quickly withdrawn from the harmful stimulation. Good? Okay. So we have the incoming information or sensory. We have integration here. And I want you to focus on the plus and the minus here. So the efferent muscle fiber or the motor command comes via the efferent pathway and causes the flexors to flex. So that's a positive response. However, the interneurons are inhibiting the extensors. Do you see that? A negative sign. The interneurons are inhibiting the extensors, and this is done to prevent this is done so that the traumatized body part can quickly be withdrawn from the stimulation. Okay, so that's withdrawal reflex. I'll stop here and start a